Okay, so we're going to talk about a period in time known in England as the Reformation. And we're going to talk about a king. Now, we've already just mentioned bad King John, and I'm going to talk about another king, and I just want to straw poll of hands. On the whole good king, bad king spectrometer, Henry VIII, put your hands up if you think good king. One. Bad king? Quite a few. Right, let me just try and see if I can swap your minds to get more good kings than bad kings. Here is Henry VIII. Not his most flattering portrait, I have to say. He said that's after Holbein, who's also famous for his other famous portraits. Do you know the famous one? He's doing his power pose. You remember like this? Wonder Woman pose. So Henry VIII. Henry VIII, more than anything else, he wanted a son to carry on the royal line. He married his first wife, who was Catherine of Aragon. And between them, they could only produce a living daughter. Henry wanted to divorce his first wife in order to marry another woman to produce a son. In order to do that, he had to get permission from the Pope in Rome, because it was, of course, a spiritual matter to get a divorce, church matter. But for all sorts of political reasons, the Pope said no. So now Henry was in a bit of a bind. And so what he did essentially was make himself the Pope in his own country, as simple as that. And he took over the church, and it made him extremely powerful because he was not now in charge of just the state, but also people's religious beliefs as well. Now Henry, what he did was, in the process of taking over the church, he also closed down all the church religious houses and all the monasteries. You have to remember that the monasteries in medieval times were very, very powerful. They controlled most of the industry and about 25% of the wealth of this country. Sheep production, and let's not forget that wool was the biggest export in England at that time. Beer production, very important. Iron production, and many other forms of industry as well. So the church was very, very rich, owned a lot of land and a lot of buildings. And Henry simply closed them all down, or dissolved them, and that was known as the dissolution. But in doing so, he made himself exceedingly rich, perhaps at that time the richest king in Christendom or in Europe. And he lavished the money upon himself. He built himself over 30 palaces, including perhaps the most famous at the time, a palace called Nonsuch Palace. Now there's not much left of Nonsuch Palace today, as this display shows you. You see this piece of iron here? Yeah. This number 5 there. That's all we can see. There's not much left of Nonsuch Palace. Where it is, which was down in Surrey, is just a park now. And Nonsuch Palace, it was called Nonsuch Palace because there was none such palace like it. He also built himself a navy. So suddenly Britain was a powerful place in the world. It was more powerful now as a navy than the Spanish Navy, which was the most powerful navy at that time. Now, in order to facilitate taking over the Church of England, he did one more thing, and that was he had the Bible printed in English. And that was very important because it meant that people could read scripture for the first time, and that encouraged literacy. Now just think about this. Shakespeare, who was born in the 1560s, his mother and father were born in the time of Henry VIII. They were illiterate. Shakespeare, of course, was anything but. And that was a direct result of Henry taking over the church, closing down the monastic schools, and then through Henry VIII closing down the monastic schools, grammar schools were introduced and a new kind of education. Henry also spent the money. He wasn't a king who kind of sat on all that money like the richest king. You remember King Croesus sitting on all that money? He spent the money. And that meant that everybody was employed. Historians from that time say that this country never had it so good. Everyone was making it money. Have you ever heard of something called the trickle-down economy, which economists argue all about the time today? That really happened in Henry VIII's time. It was the biggest real estate sale in British history, and everyone did very, very well out of Henry. However, we have to say, Henry had a monstrous temper, a monstrous ego. In his own lifetime, he was described as the most cruel and dangerous man in the world. And let's not forget, he was also a serial wife killer. So, in conclusion, can I have a show of hands again? Henry, anybody good king? 2, 3. And bad king, 3. I've done my best, Henry, for you. That's all I can say. Right, for our next stop, we're going to move on to the next century, and we're going from the Reformation to the Restoration.